Hey, Shalom, Rastafari. Let's get right in this. This article right here was disturbing. Professor who said black people can't be racist spews, I think they say racism, right? Okay, let's click on this particular page right here. We saw this while we was watching InfoWars, the nightly news with the sane man. Really love you, David Knight, and also for bringing up the NJ Weed Man, and also having a fully informed jury association. Okay, let's bring up this page. You can go to InfoWars, MSNBC's pundit, and let me just point this out while the page loads in. Let's do this right here. You really need to read this particular book, the ISIS Papers, and really to understand what it's speaking of systemically by Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, right? Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. This is the sister right here, right? And it's filed under African American Studies and Psychology, Third World Press. Okay, Chicago, Soviet. Right, so here, ISIS Papers right here, now the page is loading in. While it loads in, it says, during the course of the struggle of African people against European racism, speaking systemically more than just so-called individually, brutality and domination, many innovative thinkers have risen from our ranks. The greatest and most courageous scholars have devoted their lives to the pursuit of an explanation for the virtually inherent animosity most white people appear to have toward people of color. I'll just tell you one thing they don't touch on, because they've been deceived too, that the reptilians have deceived the Europeans, who are the last basic world rulers under the Gentile world domination, and we can get into that detail there. But anyway, unlike her predecessors, Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, a brilliant Washington, D.C. Psychiatrist, has rejected conventional notions about the origin and perpetuation of racism. Dr. Welsing's theories, lectures, and scientific papers have provoked controversy for over 20 years. Now, the compilation of her work in the ISIS Papers is destined to change the course of history. Well, this is true from Legrand Clegg, Chief Deputy City Attorney, City of Compton, California. This would be true if most people would read it and check it out for themselves. But now we have a professor who said black people can't be racist. Now remember, we're pointing this out right here, because now this is based on Nellie Fuller Jr.'s premise, and the premise basically is, if you don't understand white supremacy as racism, then everything else that you understand or think you understand will only confuse you. All right, remember, there's an info war because there's a war on for your mind, and generally speaking, we basically support the info, and the circulation, dissemination, and the great risk that ones-on-ones like Alex Jones have taken to put out information. Not that we agree with everything or everyone's opinion, but when I saw this right here, and it wasn't just that he said that, right? Because we're speaking principally. According to the principle of white supremacy, we're speaking of a systemic, right? And you remember the book, there was the book Origin of Species, right? Origin of Species, right? Origin, you check out State of Mind, that's very, right there, State of Mind, Psychology of Control, are we being controlled? It's also very interesting. It's kind of like Cliff Notes, right? Cliff Notes. Now, right here, this is Michael Eric Dyson, who we heard him on a news channel, and I mentioned it before, where his son or someone, I think it was his son, that said that after the Zimmerman trial and the not guilty decision, he asked the question like, well, or his son called and said, well, how does he's afraid, or the trial and the not guilty verdict put his child in a state of fear and trauma, and how does he protect his boys? I guess he has, grandchildren. How does he protect his boys? And instead of talking about the real systemic racism, like the black codes that disarmed the newly freed Africans after the Civil War, and these other sort of inequalities in the application of our constitutional rights, the right to carry and bear arms, and in the inner cities we've been, disarmed systemically, and it's a part of the white supremacists as a system racism. Now, I don't think Alex Jones and some of his writers like, especially maybe not Paul Joseph Watson, otherwise I think he's a great researcher, but even white people are kind of blinded to it, even though, for example, Alex Jones will say over and over, I don't want to be no slave. I don't want to be a slave. And they're trying to enslave us. And he has a natural resistance to that. But after 400 plus years, and we got to admit that it's many of our own black people, such as Michael Eric Dyson, who's not really pointing out the real roots of it, that we are talking systemically. We're speaking about attitudes and values, and sadly, intellect exercises but little control. But let's just look at this right here, what he says right here. MSNBC pundit and professor Michael Eric Dyson, who previously argued that it's impossible for black people to be racist, and I put a big question mark. One time we might have been able to say this, but like Bob Marley said, that how they make a black man star the movie or the show, and basically ones have sold their souls because they are living in the image. Biblically speaking, they're living in the image of. So they've lost their soul to really recognize certain things, and then they become easily manipulable for those in the Anglo-European or Anglo-American design. And so what they do is they'll blame the little white people who also are victims of a system, right? An Anglo-European, a British, Gentile, if we look at it biblically, or white supremacist, according to the Nellie Fuller Jr. premise. And it has nothing to do with saying all white people are racist. But, okay, let me break it down for you. Let me just briefly break this down for you. That since Origin of Species, right? We really call it Origin of Feces, right? By what's his name? I don't want to remember his name, but what's his name? The one Origin of Species. Well, what he basically said, the subtitle of the book, Darwin, right? According to Darwinianism, right? Then the eugenics comes from that, right? And first they experiment on the black people, right? First they did it to the black people, like with the Tuskegee experiments, with even, true, there were other people who were slaves, or in fact, the word slave, let's just point this out. Have you ever heard Dyson say the origin of the word slave comes from Slavic? Because compared to other forms of so-called servant, capture servant, when you war with another tribe and people could move up in that particular tribe, so forth and so on. But white supremacy, which was advocated by a small group of white folks who thought that they were superior to the other white folks. But once the whole transatlantic slave trade and the conquest of Africa came on, they had to justify why, they're treating other people who happen to be darker in skin than them so wrongly. And it was the preachers, the pastors, all coming from a eugenicist, whitewash, Gentile Christian perversion of the gospel that said that black people are cursed because of a mythological curse of Ham. And if you read the Bible, that was twisted. There was nothing in the Bible that spoke about a curse of Ham. It was a curse of Canaan. And something very interesting when we get into that whole thing right there. So what I'm saying is that when we speak about white supremacy from a scholarly and an investigated, a studied perspective and historical perspective, we are not talking about just any white person. Like some people say, I'm so angry, I want to hit some N-word, say this, during some of these racially stimulated kind of events and everything. You want to slap the first or do something to the first white person that you meet. That's a trained behavior. Prior to the 60s and integration, no Negro has that thought pattern. That's an artificial, that's a loss of soul thought pattern. Now you have these kind of professors who say that it's impossible for black people who are running around with their hair all blonded and lighting their skin and trying to live in the image, proverbially, of the beast or Darwinianism, to be racist when they've lost their soul. So they don't even understand what racism means. And this shocked me by reading what was said right here. He illustrated why so many viewers are abandoning the beleaguered network when he said that Americans would not understand racism until white kids were being killed in the same numbers as blacks. Excuse me? When most of the murders that are happening in the black on black, because they don't understand the whole Cain and Abel paradigm. Really, there's only one race, the human race. But among that one race, the human race, there are serpent people and there are true human beings, basically. The serpent goes on its belly. So a lot of these Negroes and others just run around saying what they're saying for something to eat. They're like Esau in a sense. They have sold their birthright, right? Or at least they're thinking right. Let's just say it like that. But it also connects to their birthright. So I didn't even go through the rest of the article here because I know Paul J. Watson, he says white Americans and others feel that this was a justifiable verdict. This is how things happen, not until and unless the number of white kids die that approximate the number of black and other kids who die will Americans see. He's fucking nonsense. And I think he's talking this nonsense because from our vids and others, blacks and whites, but many blacks speaking out and saying, listen, how come these guys haven't been able to address what's going on in Chicago? And besides, how come they're so much against the guns when it's not the guns that are killing people, but it's people, the blacks, who are killing other blacks and getting to the root of the fact that many of the law-abiding, hard-working black people who are victimized by other blacks, the Cain and Abel, they were black because Adam was black. I mean, those who would agree with it most definitely probably would be ones like Michael Eric Dyson, but they're missing the spiritual component, right? The only thing that is necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. So instead of speaking about how blacks in the inner cities have been disarmed, right, instead of speaking about that and the racism systemically, which might be a part of the old white racism from back in the 1800s and shit, you see what I'm saying? But it's still on the books. And these Negroes here are saying that the only way white people can understand they would understand if you taught it, if you pointed out books like Francis Cress Welsing's book. But obviously he's not going to point that out because, I'm not going to even probably go there right now. But anyway, because I know I'm short on time on this one right here, but he says why black people can't be racist. I have to tell you, one time we said, black folks used to say, black people wouldn't do this and that, and now we're finding black people doing many things that years ago they would not do. Socialization, integration, living in the image of has done a lot to warp, you understand, one's sense of soul. right? That even to propose that somehow the only explanation for racism, right? Like right here he says, according to the Justice Department, 94% of all black murder victims in the United States are killed by other black people. More blacks are murdered in Chicago every weekend than the Ku Klux Klan killed over a period of 50 years. And even though they did kill a lot of black people, right, men, women, and children, this is correct. But all of these kind of pundits here, right, are unable to address the situation because almost like Esau did, they sold their birthright for something to eat. And so instead they're making ridiculous sayings like black people can't be racist. Some black people, we see them as black people, but they don't see themselves as black people by a bunch of racist, artificial, white supremacists, systemically speaking, matrix. It's the matrix we're talking about. You see what I'm saying? This is why some white folks can say, you know, it's interesting because now we understand on a certain level, systemically speaking, how blacks must have felt because there was a system stacked up against you. Because remember, behind the whole thing is the Anglo-American, Anglo-European, the British system, which was a few inbred white folks, right, who used Darwinian so-called logic to say that, well, they are the elite, but then when they start to enslave Africans and black people and the lost sheep, the Hebrews, then they basically use their religious folks. You know, after all, many of the people still were thinking the earth was flat. You know, they use that sort of logic right there to basically make indentured servant white folks